Did your family walk on eggshells or explode without warning?
The line that cracked something open in me did not arrive as a whisper or a mistake or a joke that missed the landing. It arrived loud enough for the whole room to hear, and with the kind of certainty that tells you this was never a slip of the tongue but a belief polished over years, because my mother lifted her glass and smiled at my sister and said, "Your sister gets everything and you get nothing," and people actually laughed in that nervous way people do when they are not sure if they are witnessing a family tradition or a crime, and I felt this strange calm slide over me like I had been waiting for a referee to blow the whistle so I could finally walk off the field and stop pretending the game was fair. I did not argue or beg or perform the part they saved for me, the good sport who swallows hurt and makes it easy for everyone to keep eating cake, because I have done that for so many years I could teach a class on it. So instead I said the line I had rehearsed in my head every time they called me difficult for asking basic respect. I smiled and said, "That works, because I am leaving the country tonight and you will never hear from me again." And the way the room changed temperature without the thermostat moving would have been funny if it had not been my actual life, because forks paused halfway to mouths. The music suddenly felt too loud, and my mother's jaw actually dropped like she had been robbed in broad daylight. I wish I could tell you I planned a cinematic exit with a speech and a toast and a perfect hair flip, but the truth is simpler and probably uglier, because what really happened is that I stood there thinking about all the times I paid for holidays to keep the peace, all the times I changed flights to make their schedules work, all the times I sat in the back of my own life while my sister got the front row and somehow also the microphone, and I realized this was not some new low, it was the moment they finally said out loud what they had been saying with actions forever, and hearing it spoken made something mechanical click into place inside me, like a deadbolt turning. People always ask why I kept showing up if it was this bad, and I get it, because from the outside it looks simple, you just stop going where you are not wanted. But inside a family you convince yourself that if you keep proving you are reasonable and generous and patient, eventually they will get tired of taking advantage. And then you wake up at a party where your mother announces the inheritance like it is a raffle drawing and you are the only one whose number was never in the bowl, and you realize they were never confused, they were just comfortable. My sister, whose favorite hobby is pretending to be surprised by gifts she helped pick, did this breathy "oh come on, she is joking," which would have been cute if we were all still in middle school. And my mother tried to backpedal with that smile she uses when servers bring the wrong order, and she blames them for not reading her mind. And I stood there not shaking for once, because the decision was already made, and when a decision is real it is quiet inside you. It does not beg for permission. I could feel a dozen eyes asking the same question. Is she bluffing? Is she angry and dramatic and about to make a scene? Or does she actually have a bag packed somewhere and a plan that does not include us? And that suspicion tasted better than any cake in the room. Because for the first time they were not confident about me, and doubt is a powerful thing when it lands in the lap of people who have never had to doubt their place. I did not give them details, I did not list flights or countries or timelines, because I have learned the lesson you learn the hard way after years of being mined for information and then punished for using it, which is that you never hand your map to people who keep moving your finish line. So I just held my glass and let the silence stretch long enough for everyone to feel their own thoughts. And in that quiet, I remembered an earlier holiday when I covered everything while they called me independent, as if that word was a compliment and not a receipt, and I told myself that if they could say the quiet part out loud tonight, then I could say my quiet part too and mean it. What I did next was not dramatic to anyone else, but it was the most honest thing I have done with them in years. Because I put my phone on Do Not Disturb, and I did not hug anyone goodbye, and I walked toward the door without apologizing for the inconvenience, and I could hear my name said in 3 different tones behind me, soft, scolding, and stunned. And I knew each tone came with its own set of strings, and I did not take any of them, which is how you finally start leaving, not with a suitcase, but with a sentence you do not take back. And if you are wondering whether I was bluffing or whether there was a real plan waiting after the parking lot, I will tell you this much and nothing more right now. I had been preparing for this moment far longer than they had been preparing that cruel toast, and the only question left in the room was how much I had already moved without them noticing. The funny thing about a breaking point is that it rarely arrives as a single dramatic collision with the floor, but more like a slow shuffle toward the edge that you keep telling yourself is only a painted line. And I think mine started the year my sister received a car with a bow while I was told that taking the bus built resilience. Continued through the semester her tuition was miraculously covered while I got lectures about character and grit. And then climaxed on a holiday weekend when I paid for the rental house, the groceries, the wine, and the cleanup crew just to prevent the ritual family meltdown. Only to be called independent with that shiny tone that means they enjoy your generosity, but have no intention of sharing the cost or the credit. I kept going because we are trained to believe that families are work and that love requires patience and that unfairness is just a phase you can outlast if you master the right blend of humility and humor, yet the math always came out the same. Because every milestone for my sister was a group project where the group was me, while every milestone for me somehow became a character test I failed if I dared to ask for help, and when I let myself say that truth out loud in my own head it sounded harsh. But it also sounded like the only version that explained why I had a spreadsheet of expenses no one else even remembered agreeing to. There was a day, months before the party, when my mother called to ask if I could co-sign a loan to help my sister close on a house faster, because the market was competitive and timing was everything and family should pull together. And when I said I was not comfortable risking my credit for someone who had repeatedly ignored my boundaries, the conversation flipped so quickly from loving to scolding that I ended the call with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. And I sat there thinking about how the word family had become a password they used to unlock my wallet. That night I opened a separate account and started moving a portion of every paycheck where no one could see it on the joint budgeting app they insisted we use for transparency. A word that had always seemed to mean I needed to report my savings while they reported their intentions, and I scheduled automatic transfers so discretion would not depend on willpower, because I already knew they would escalate just before any big date, and I did not want my resolve to be a coin toss each time they dialed my number with sweet voices and urgent needs. I began selling small things that were mine and mine only, not because I needed the cash to breathe, but because I wanted to feel the muscle of choosing myself getting stronger, and I booked a one-way ticket for a date that looked harmless on the calendar. And I interviewed for a job abroad through a friend who did not know my family story and therefore could not be swayed by it, and when the offer came through I stared at the email for a long time before accepting, feeling a door swing inward. In a house I had not realized I owned. Meanwhile, I kept showing up in a measured way, not because I had softened or forgiven, but because letting them think I was still auditioning for their approval kept them loud and sloppy people put evidence on the record without being asked. Which is how I saved messages, receipts, and promises I knew they would later claim I misunderstood, building a quiet file that reminded me I was not crazy, I was simply done. If you want to know when preparation turned into action, it happened at the party after my line landed and the room lost its balance, because I stepped into the hallway, opened my banking app, and canceled the autopay on the family phone plan that had been a favor I never minded until it became a leash. I reassigned the streaming accounts I purchased to my personal email and changed the passwords. And I forwarded the contract for the upcoming holiday rental to my sister with a calm note that the deposit and all remaining balances were now in her name since the gathering was clearly a celebration of her status. Then I emailed the caterer for a baby shower I had somehow become responsible for and asked them to update the billing contact. And none of that was cruel or vindictive, it was just the bill going to the table that had been ordering without looking at prices. I hit send on each change without a flourish, knowing there would be a small explosion the moment their phones lost service, or their shows logged them out, or the caterer called to confirm the new card. And what I felt was not triumph so much as steadiness. The kind you only get when you stop arguing with reality and start acting like the person you wish they had allowed you to be. And as I slid the phone back into my bag, I realized I had finally done something that could not be undone with a family group text and a guilt parade. I returned to the room and let them fill the air with nervous jokes and half apologies and little digs about my sense of humor, because I already knew that while they scrambled to put out the tiny fires I had set with 3 emails and a few taps, A much larger fuse was already burning in a place they had not thought to check, and as I smiled at the table and raised my glass to a toast I did not believe in, I could feel the second door in that house inside me opening wider, the one that led past the yard and into the street, where the car was not the point and the map did not belong to them, and the only thing they had left to hold on to was a confidence that would not survive what I had arranged next. If you want to understand how a person like me, who had been trained since childhood to make everything easier for everyone else, finally builds a plan that does not ask permission, you have to picture a long corridor of small doors that I opened one at a time while smiling in family photos and nodding through lectures about gratitude, because none of this was fireworks or headlines. It was a steady string of quiet choices that, taken together, became a life I could actually live without their hands on every switch. I started with the boring foundation no one celebrates, the financial firewall that keeps guilt from logging in. So I went to a credit union where no one knew my last name and opened an account under a new email address I had never used with them. Then I set up automatic transfers that moved money out of my visible checking before I ever saw it. I froze my credit with the bureaus so no one could surprise me with sudden applications that I would be asked to co-sign in the name of family unity. And I routed cashback rewards into a separate digital wallet that never touched the shared budgeting app, a tiny stream that felt like a private vote of confidence each time it landed. I changed the quiet details they never think about because the people in charge rarely learn the plumbing, so I ported my phone number off the family plan and onto a prepaid service in my name only. I created security questions that had nothing to do with my childhood memories so no one could guess their way in. I rented a post office box and forwarded sensitive mail there, and I put my passport, birth certificate, and the titles I actually owned into a small safe deposit box that lived behind a door only I could open, which sounds dramatic until you remember how many times my documents had been borrowed to expedite someone else's paperwork. Then I told exactly 2 people outside the family, one friend who knows how to keep her mouth shut and one mentor who only cares about whether a plan works, and I gave them the accountability I used to hand to my mother like a bouquet. Because I needed voices that would not cave when my family played the greatest hits, and I drew up a boring list of steps that I pinned to the inside of my cabinet door where no one but me would see it, flights and visas and onboarding packets and a timeline that ended with me in a different time zone when the next holiday season rolled around. I kept my online life strategically dull, posting throwback pictures of old hikes and secondhand furniture, so the feed suggested a woman stuck in place. And I let my sister brag about a future that featured me as a built-in helper because her overconfidence was the camouflage I needed. While I ran interviews at strange hours with a company that did not care about my family tree and negotiated a salary that would let me land without running to anyone for a cushion, and when the contract arrived, I read it twice, signed it without circulating it for opinions, and saved the confirmation in 3 places that no one else could access. Because I knew they would not respect a simple goodbye, I pre-stacked a row of dominoes that would fall without my hands on them. So I scheduled written notices that revoked me as the emergency contact at 2 medical offices where my mother had added me without asking. I submitted the opt-out forms that removed my name from a storage unit lease I had been carrying under the story of temporary help. I set calendar triggers to cancel the joint memberships that had quietly become my monthly duty. And I prepared a clean record of holiday invoices and transfers labeled by date and purpose, not to fight them with but to fight myself with when the urge to backslide hit, and I needed hard proof that I was not being dramatic. I was reacting to math. For people who love a loud reveal, this will sound unsatisfying, yet each click mattered, because the day you stop asking what will make them calm down and start asking what will keep you safe is the day you become less interesting to their control. And as I built that safety, I also began a different track that felt less like defense and more like a chess move, because I pulled the file my grandmother left me, the one everyone pretended did not exist, because it made the family narrative inconvenient, and I met with an attorney who speaks fluent boundary and asked very precise questions about rights I had never exercised, and I left that office with a path that was both lawful and simple, which in my world is the definition of power. I did not wave that folder around at the party because the best leverage never announces itself. It just sits quietly until it is time to turn, and while they laughed and toasted and tried to stuff my sentence back into a box, a notary appointment already lived on my calendar, a set of filings stood ready in draft form, and 2 certified letters waited in my bag with stamps on them, each addressed to a place that had been very comfortable pretending I was sentimental rather than meticulous. And if you are wondering whether my revenge would be a spectacle or a signature, I can tell you that watching someone discover you have options they never bothered to consider is its own kind of fireworks. And the first spark was scheduled to land on their doorstep before the weekend turned into a work week they would never forget. If you have ever watched someone hold a door open with their foot because they are so sure the room belongs to them that they cannot imagine the hinge closing, then you understand the mood my mother carried around the old condo my grandmother left behind. A modest place that had been in the family for longer than any of our current arguments, and that everyone treated as a sentimental backdrop for photos and an unquestioned future asset for my sister, even though the one piece of paper that actually mattered did not care about their certainty and had my name printed in the exact place where wishes end and ownership begins. Before the party, I had sat in a quiet office that smelled like toner and legal pads while an attorney walked me through the simplest path I have ever been offered by an adult in this family. A path that did not require a public fight or a dramatic confrontation, but only a notary, an affidavit, a certified packet to the county recorder, and a notice to the property manager, because my grandmother, who had always loved me without footnotes, had signed a transfer on death designation that never made it into the family gossip circuit, and with her signature and my identification the title moved without anyone needing to perform shock or arrange a tribunal. Which is why I left that office with instructions I could follow without asking for approval and a quiet knowledge that the story they had written for the condo was about to be replaced by the one the law recognized. While my mother practiced ownership as a personality trait and my sister treated the place like a personal storage unit disguised as nostalgia, I used a lunch break to record the documents and another hour to walk through a short list of practical steps. Redirecting rent to the account they could not see, changing the lockbox code with the manager who had long since stopped expecting our family to act like adults, and authorizing an inspection that would make a sale clean, because there is a difference between throwing a grenade and flipping a switch, and I have come to prefer the switch, especially when the people in the room only notice the lights went out after they trip over the furniture. The certified letters in my bag, the ones I mentioned while smiling at the party like the room did not smell like burnt sugar and cheap flattery, were addressed to my mother and my sister, and they did not swagger or insult or rehearse old arguments. They simply attached copies of the recorded documents, notified them of the change in title and in rent, revoked any informal access to the unit, set out a date by which any personal items left inside would be boxed and stored at their expense if uncollected, and provided the contact for the agent handling the listing, which means that while they were still arguing about whether my threat to leave was a dramatic bluff that would blow over after a tearful brunch, the mail was already on its way to inform them that something more concrete than my patience had run out. People hear revenge, and they picture slashed tires or public shaming or some wild confession. Yet what I learned over the past year is that the most satisfying form of payback is making the system work for you after you have been told your whole life that systems are not for you. So when the preliminary offer came in at asking price and the inspection noted only minor fixes, I signed what I needed to sign, scheduled the work, and kept my mouth shut, understanding that the first time they would really believe this was happening would not be when a notary stamped a page or when rent failed to arrive in a familiar account, but when they saw a picture of the condo online with a clean description and a phone number that did not ring in our house. I did not send them the link. I did not taunt them with proof. I did not make a scene in the group chat, because the point was never to humiliate them publicly. It was to remove my life from their reach and to redirect value they treated like a family myth into the actual future I was building, and the day the funds cleared after closing and landed in the account I had set up at the credit union, I sat in my car with the window shut and felt a kind of quiet that I had only ever felt as a child. When my grandmother would hold my hand in church and squeeze once to tell me she was there, and it occurred to me that this was the first time in years that anything in our family had ended without me apologizing for having needs. At the party, I raised my glass because someone asked for a toast, and I knew it would amuse them to see me act normal after my line detonated the room, and while they watched for cracks in my face and waited for me to break character. My phone buzzed in my bag with a simple message from the title officer confirming recording and disbursement, which meant that while they still believed they could fix this with a call and a guilt trip, the hinge had already closed, the lock was already turned, and the keys they always dangled in front of me were officially ornamental, and as I set the glass down and met my mother's eyes, I realized that the condo had never been the point so much as the lesson. Because you cannot starve a person for years and then act surprised when she learns to cook for herself, and if you are wondering whether I plan to tell them any of this before I disappeared into a different time zone, I will say only that the next thing scheduled to land in their world was not a conversation, but a calendar reminder from the past coming due, and when it did, whatever confidence remained would not survive the sound it made when it hit the floor. The thing about leaving is that people think it is a sprint to the door with a bag in your hand and anger in your throat, but the real version looks more like a quiet sequence that drains the room of all the tricks they have used on you for years, which is why, after the party thinned and the jokes got weaker and the apologies started to taste like old gum, I stood in the driveway and turned my phone back on long enough to send one scheduled message to my attorney confirming that the second packet could go out at sunrise, one scheduled message to my mentor confirming the relocation stipend had landed, and one scheduled message to my friend with the simplest request a person like me can make, which was to stop me if I tried to crawl back through the old door in the morning, and then I got in the rideshare and did not look at the house. Not because I am cinematic, but because there was nothing left in it that belonged to me except the history they insist is a debt. Morning brought the calendar reminder I had set months ago when I still believed I might get sentimental and talk myself into another round. A reminder labeled plainly with the words "send the ledger" and "close the loop," and inside that scheduled message, which went to my mother and my sister and copied the family accountant who has always pretended to be neutral, I attached a clean list of transfers, receipts, deposits, and confirmations covering years of holidays and emergencies that had somehow always been mine, with each line item described in normal language and each total calculated not as a bill to be paid, but as a record that made my memory undeniable. Followed by a short paragraph that said I was done funding a story that cast me as the resource and them as the protagonists, that any memberships, plans, or policies relying on my name or my card had already been canceled or reassigned, that any requests for help should be directed to the adults who benefited, and that, further, contact about finances should go through the email address of my counsel, which is another way of saying no more midnight negotiations, no more backroom edits, no more guilt invoices disguised as love. By the time they read it, I was already at the airport with a passport that lived in my own pocket and a boarding pass I had printed at a kiosk with no shared account attached. And while I waited, I opened one last draft I had written on a Wednesday night in spring when my hands were steady and my head was clear, a draft addressed not to them, but to the foundation that runs scholarships in my grandmother's name. And I allocated a small but unmistakable portion of the sale proceeds to a fund for young women who hear the phrase "stand on your own" used as a weapon, because if there is going to be a family legacy, then let it be a legacy that does not require kneeling. And I signed that form without calling for commentary and sent it from a coffee shop table where no one knew my face, thinking how my grandmother would have approved of the math and of the edge I finally learned to keep. The replies from home came in predictable chords, the stunned violin from my mother demanding a conversation about loyalty and optics, the angry drum from my sister accusing me of theft from a future she had already spent in her head, and the low hum from an uncle who had never texted me before but suddenly wanted to mediate, and I let them stack up without opening because there is no new information inside those instruments. And I forwarded every message to a folder my attorney can see and switched on an auto-reply that said, in one long sentence that felt almost like a blessing, that I am safe, that I have chosen distance, that legal notices have been served, that urgent matters can route through counsel, and that non-urgent matters can wait indefinitely, because absence is not a threat when it is your own boundary, it is simply a room where their voices cannot reach. People think the most satisfying moment was the wire landing or the security line or the little charitable confirmation email. But the truth is that the most satisfying moment was the quiet walk down the jet bridge when my phone finally stopped vibrating and I realized I did not owe anyone a reaction. And I sat down and closed my eyes and let myself consider the radical idea that winning might look like boredom to the people who fed on my drama, and that perhaps adulthood is less a fireworks show and more a steady hand on your own wheel. And somewhere over the ocean, I wrote the last piece of the plan in a notes app, a simple rule that I knew I would need when the nostalgia hit, which was that any return requires a version of them I have never met and a version of me that has no interest in additions. And until both exist, the only conversation worth having is with a future that is finally mine. They will tell their version of this for a long time, a version where I was impulsive and cruel and ungrateful, and they will pass it around like a dish they secretly know is stale, and I will let them. Not because I am a saint, but because the last move of a master plan is refusing to play the game after you have already won. And if you need one final image, it is this: not a goodbye at a gate or a dramatic speech at a party, but the sound a door makes when it closes softly and latches, the sound of a hinge that used to be held open by my fear sliding into its rightful place. And on the other side of that door is a life with my name on the title page, a balance sheet that finally balances, and a silence I did not weaponize but earned. A silence that says they wanted me to have nothing, and now the nothing they receive is exactly the measure of what I am no longer willing to give.